Welcome to UPG Pathshala. I am Gautam Chaube, an assistant professor at the Department of English at ARSD College of Delhi University. The objective here is to take you through a module titled Neoclassical Criticism, Dryden and Pope. In the course of my lecture today, I'll take you through the module. I will help you identify the philosophical and the historical foundations of neoclassical criticism and also encourage you to problematize and ask questions about some of the received wisdom about neoclassicism. Let me clarify at the very beginning that this module deals with the tradition of neoclassical criticism in England as opposed to other countries of the world, say Germany. It's important to establish the difference between the current of neoclassical criticism in England as compared to neoclassical tendencies in other parts of Europe. In Germany, for example, it meant a movement away from Roman culture and a movement towards German culture. If we have to summarize neoclassical tendencies, neoclassical culture in England, perhaps a good way to introduce the subject is to examine the epitaph which Alexander Pope wrote on a monument erected in Westminster Abbey in memory of Sir Isaac Newton. The epitaph reads as follows: "Nature and nature's law lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light." Clearly, the objective here is to take Newtonian mission of making manifest the laws of nature into the domain of literature. Just as Newton made evident laws of nature, the author is expected to make evident through his writing, through his poetry, through the drama, the transcendental laws of nature. And this approach, this desire, this objective can be best summarized through Pope's quotation, where he describes in an essay on criticism the objective as what oft was thought but never so well expressed. The objective here is to reveal, is to articulate the laws of nature, things which are known to the world, things which were often thought but never before spoken or articulated with such clarity. It is therefore important to examine the sources and the origin of neoclassical criticism in England. European revival in England was triggered by European Renaissance. However, the neoclassicists in particular, drew heavily upon French and Italian interpretation of neoclassical criticism. And two of the French neoclassicists who stand out are Pierre Corneille and Nicolas Bouloux-de-Proix. Pierre Corneille wrote an important treatise where he argued that it was not enough to copy the classical precepts. In fact, the classical precepts of the Greco-Roman period must be set in tune with the changing taste of the modern times. Similarly, Bouloux, in his works, through his arguments, which were also translated by Dryden in England, argued that one needs to move away from the focus on saints and scriptures in the medieval literature and move towards the secular Greco-Roman heroes, towards scriptures, towards non-scriptural literature. So in a sense, with Nicolas Bouloux, we see a kind of secularization of literature, a secularization of criticism. And this tendency we also see in England. For example, if you look at and if you examine very closely the foundation of Augustinism, the foundation of neoclassicism, you will realize that the comparison which was drawn between Charles II and Augustus, Roman Emperor Augustus, is based on this secular tendency. It's important to understand here that the restored monarchy is not the same as the previous monarchy. Between 1660 and between the Puritan interval and restoration, the monarchy lost its divine right, lost its divine agency, lost its divine mission. So the king was no longer possible, it was no longer tenable to compare the king to sacred sources of authority. Consequently, the king at best could be compared to Charles II, a secular source of authority. And therefore, Pax Romana becomes an aspirational ideal for Pax Britannica. The point that I was making here is that through Corneille and Bouloux, neoclassicists in England realize that it is important, A, to revise Greco-Roman cultural precepts rather than inculcate them, rather than follow them blindly. And B, one needs to move away from the emphasis which was seen in the medieval times on scriptures and saints towards secular heroes of Greco-Roman times and towards nature. The next objective is to identify the role of critic and what did it mean to be a critic in the neoclassical times. And it's important to emphasize here that from the very beginning, critical activity was seen as opposed to, as in an oppositional relationship to creative activity, and critics were often derided. I'll substantiate my argument by reading a quote from English historian Thomas Rymer, where he argues that the absence of criticism or the lack of critics in England has been to the advantage of literary enterprise in England. I'll read the quotation right now. The quotation appears in Rymer's translation of Rapin's view on Aristotle. It appears in the preface to Rymer's translation on Rapin's views on Aristotle. It reads as follows: all of late years, England was free from critics, as it is from wolves, that a harmless, well-meaning book might pass without danger. But now this privilege, whatever extraordinary talent it requires, is usurped by the most ignorant, and they who are least acquainted with the game are aptest to bark at everything that comes in their way. Clearly, a comparison is drawn by Rymer between critics and wolves, and they are compared to dogs who bark with little merit. In other words, he draws a hierarchical relationship between critics and creative authors being on a higher pedestal. By contrast, if you look at the neoclassical idea of critic, someone like Pope did not find any kind of conflict or tension between the role of the poet and the role of the critic. For Pope, both the critic as well as the poet endeavored to manifest, to make evident the laws of nature. And I'll substantiate this by reading another quote from Alexander Pope. It reads as follows: both must alike from heaven derive their light, those born to judge as well as those born to write. Clearly, for Pope, there is no tension between those who are born to judge and those who are born to write. Once the tension is resolved, we will realize that during the neoclassical period, critical faculties were seen as important as creative faculties, since the idea was to write in accordance with certain rules. Rules of judgment became integral to the creative process itself. Consequently, a literary critic was expected to be both a poet, and at times he expanded his horizon of creative activities and undertook tasks such as translation, such as editing journals, and of course he was a poet. And both the poet as well as the critic were expected to be self-critical, were expected to be aware of their limitations. Having said that, let us now look at the idea of critic through the figure of somebody who is described as the founder of the tradition of criticism in England, Dryden. If you read Dryden very closely, you will realize that his critical thoughts are often contradictory and are inconsistent. Now, it's important here to understand the reason why Dryden appears to be inconsistent in terms of or with respect to his critical thoughts. And these reasons I want you to understand and notice very carefully. First, the tradition of criticism in England did not have a prehistory. Dryden, being the inaugurator of the tradition, had little precedents to fall back upon. Consequently, there were inconsistencies. Number two, his critical thoughts appear scattered through the occasional prefaces which he wrote for his own creative works. In other words, they were not compiled and produced together as one complete or continuous text, and therefore the contradiction. Number three, Pope Unlike Pope, Dryden lived in a time where the social and the religious orientation of his own society kept changing. And as this orientation changed, Dryden too had to adjust to the changing morality of his time in order to earn patronage. So, on the death of Oliver Campbell, he wrote poems commemorating the life and mourning the death of Oliver Campbell. Very soon, he welcomed Charles II through Astrea Redux in 1660. Similarly, in one of his works, Religio Laici, he supports Anglicanism, and a few years later, he writes The Hind and the Panther in support of Catholic faith. So the point is, since Pope had to adapt to the changing sensibilities of his time, he also had to since Dryden had to adapt to the changing sensibilities of his time, he also had to adapt and change his critical stance. Therefore, we see inconsistencies in his critical thoughts on the three reasons that we just mentioned. Compared to Dryden, whose critical thoughts appear riddled with contradictions, we find that Pope is fairly consistent. However, nothing had changed in terms of the milieu, in terms of the socio-political ethos of the age. Little has changed. The age it still was polarized between different political positions, polarized between different religious positions, and this polarization can be best summarized through an epigram which Pope etched on the collar to a pup which he gifted the Prince of Wales. I'll read the epigram. It reads as follows: I am His Highness's dog at Kew. Pray tell me, sir, whose dog at you? I am His Highness's dog at Kew. Pray tell me, sir, whose dog are you? This epigram captures the polarization. In order to succeed as a poet or as a critic, one had to be somebody's quote-unquote dog. In other words, you had to earn patronage. You had to earn patronage of political parties. And very often, identities were imposed on unsuspecting individuals, on individuals who were allegedly neutral. Pope describes his own dilemma when faced with such imposition of identities, and he writes, verse man or prose man, term me what you will, Papist or Protestant, or both between, like good Erasmus, in an honest mean, in moderation placing all my glory, while Tories call me Whig and Whigs a Tory. While Tories call me Whig and Whigs a Tory. This was the great dilemma which poets and critics of the age faced. However, unlike Dryden, Pope could be consistent with his critical thoughts and with his faith for the simple reason that the institution of patronage was getting weakened by the days and was being substituted and was being replaced by the commerce of the market. So the publishers became the new patrons. And because Pope, with Pope we see the emergence of perhaps the first professional author who wrote not for patrons but for publishers. So this reliance on patronage, this reliance on publishers instead of patrons, this reliance on the commerce of books, this reliance on the mood of the market rather than the religious or the social mood of the society gave the authors and the critics a great degree of freedom which they exercised both at the time of writing their poetry as well as at the time of exercising their critical judgment. So what exactly were poets and critics during the Neoclassical age were expected to do? They were expected to follow nature. The reliance on nature as opposed to scripture, the reliance on secular heroes, secular sources of authority as opposed to sacred sources of authorities was the most central tenet of Neoclassicism. And this reliance on nature, Pope describes it in his essay on criticism as, first follow nature and your judgment frame, by her just standard, which is still the same. Unerring nature, still divinely bright, one clear, unchanged and universal light. Life, force and beauty must to all impart, at once the source and end and test of art. So the poet was expected to rely on nature and the transcendental truth which the nature represented. However, the idea of nature, as Pope elaborates in the essay, appears a little confusing, and this is the reason why John Dennis, in his infamous attack on Alexander Pope's essay on criticism, argues that Pope refuses in his essay to differentiate between nature and rules. Further, he does not elaborate what exactly does he mean by nature. Now remember, nature as an idea was also central to the Romantic period, which follows the Neoclassical age. In the Romantic period, during the Romantic period, nature was seen as a source of authority, but nature was also seen as a semi-divine power. For the Neoclassicist, however, the emphasis was not so much on this divine aspect of nature, on pantheism, but nature as the fountainhead of the cosmic rules. By nature, they meant not just the mountains and the rivers and the forests, but they meant the cosmic rule, the entire rule, the order of this entire cosmos. So that their notion was nature was far more inclusive as compared to the Romantic notion of nature. This leads us to the question as to what exactly is the defining quality of poetry and criticism. Is observance of nature enough? In his famous preface to the works of Shakespeare, Samuel Johnson argues that a man must move beyond nature. That observance of nature, following nature, is desirable, but a man must be familiar, a poet must be familiar with all forms of life, with different forms of knowledge. In the history of Rasselas, Samuel Johnson argues that no man has ever been famous by imitation, and that imitation of nature should not be restrictive. The poet, the author, must move beyond nature and try to imitate all forms of life. In Pope, we see a desire to move beyond nature, not in the sense of rejecting nature, but in the sense of improving upon nature. In Epistle to Burlington, Pope argues, "Let nature never be forget, but treat the goddess like a modest fair, nor overdress, nor leave her wholly bare." The idea is not to overdress nature, not to impose culture and skills and art on nature to the extent that the natural genius gets clouded. At the same time, it's equally desirable not to leave the nature unattended. Pope's argument about nature in this particular context appears in his reflection on the tradition of landscape gardening in England. Pope himself was an avid gardener, and the garden in Neoclassical period became a metaphor for orderliness, for harmony between nature and art, between the natural topography and the skills of the gardener. And according to Pope, there has to be a balance between the way in which the garden tends to the landscape and the natural topography, the natural features of the garden. So it should not be overdressed. At the same time, it should not be left unattended either. The essence of it can be captured through a phrase, artful wilderness. There has to be elements of wild, it has to be wild, it has to be untamed, but it also should be artful. The skill should also be made to bear upon the wilderness of the nature. Now, since I have argued earlier in this presentation that rules of judgment had become integral to the creative process itself, and that poets were expected to imitate nature, imitate the Greco-Roman authors, and there was a greater emphasis on form, what oft was thought but never so well expressed. Should we assume that the Neoclassicists outlawed imagination and that they relied only on imitation? Now, there's clearly a shift away from the fantastic literature of the medieval periods towards realism. We see a movement from fantasy to realism. And one of the ways in which we can explain this movement towards realism is by looking at the new genre of novel. In 18th century, the novel arrived with aplomb and claimed, among other things, that it did not exaggerate, it represented things just as they were, that the histories it described were basically testimonies of eyewitness, and that it offered the readers an intimacy which bordered on voyeurism. Very often the readers were encouraged to read private letters of these characteristics, of the characters in the novel. So novel placed greatest emphasis on realism, on representation of things just as they are. And this fascination of the age with novel perhaps explains, among other reasons, why there was such an emphasis on realism, there was such an emphasis on representation, there was such an emphasis on mimesis during the Neoclassical period. So since there was such an emphasis on imitation, such an emphasis on realism, should we, and I reiterate, assume that the Neoclassicists outlaw imagination? Well, certainly not. Early in the lecture, I had argued how Samuel Johnson, in the history of Rasselas as well as in his preface to the works of Shakespeare, had argued that it's essential to move beyond nature and to encompass other forms of life. I had also referred to Pope, where he argues that nature should not be left unattended, that there has to be a degree of artful wilderness. So now let us very quickly examine the reasons which encouraged the author to move beyond the classical precepts, the need to adhere to nature, the need to follow mimesis, and the need to be realist as far as possible. The first reason is that some of the key concepts of the Neoclassical period were very poorly defined. For example, the idea of wit. The idea of wit had a range of connotations. In Dryden, Dryden thinks very highly of wit, whereas Pope equates wit with satanic pride. For he finds wit very, very problematic. To add to the confusion, a number of authors in this period who wrote a very intelligent commentary in a conversational style, who were urbane in their manners, were described as wits. So the first reason is that some of the key concepts, such as what constitutes wit, what do we mean by imagination, what is fancy, were very, very poorly defined during the period. Number two, there was an assumption that some of the classical precepts were indeed stifling, and this assumption was based on the understanding that these precepts themselves were not derived from nature. Had they been derived from nature, had these classical precepts been derived from nature, perhaps they wouldn't have been so stifling. But Neoclassicists felt that some of the classical precepts, some of the Greco-Roman values were in fact not based on nature and were impractical. Number three, the Neoclassicists themselves introduced new criteria of judgment. For example, many of them were of the opinion that tragicomedy, a genre which was considered profane, a genre which mixed together two other forms of comedy, two other forms of drama, namely comedy and tragedy, was considered as inappropriate. The Neoclassicists, for example, thought very highly of the genre of tragicomedy. In other words, not only did they move beyond nature, not only did they inculcate classical precepts of Greco-Roman authors, but in fact they also introduced some of the key ideas, some of the parameters of judgment themselves. For example, Shakespeare was often compared to the ancients. Shakespeare was seen as somebody who was as worthy as the ancients for the simple reason that he had survived the test of time, that the fascination with Shakespeare, the society's fascination with his literary work seemed not to diminish. For the simple reason that his popularity remains undiminished, Shakespeare was seen as somebody comparable to the ancients. So the three reasons why the Neoclassicists could move beyond imagination, could move beyond mimesis, could move beyond a strict adherence to realism was: number one, the classical precepts were poorly defined; number two, the neoclassicists introduced new ideas of criticism themselves, new parameters of criticism themselves. So to conclude, the module took you through the emergence of neoclassicism in England. In the very beginning, we tried to differentiate between neoclassical thoughts in England compared to neoclassical thoughts in countries like France and Germany. We tried to argue that neoclassicism in England, although the classical revival was triggered by European Renaissance, it got further impetus through Italian and French interpretation of classical values. Neoclassical criticism in England drew heavily from French neoclassical critics. We examined the figure of the critic. Because the module is titled criticism, it's important to understand the role of the critic, the figure of the critic, and we tried to examine the figure of the critic through two examples, by looking at Dryden and by looking at Pope. We also discussed the difference between Dryden as a critic and Pope as a critic, the reasons as to why Dryden there were contradictions in Dryden's critical thoughts compared to Pope, whose thoughts were more or less coherent. We also examined the reasons why Pope could exercise his critical faculties perhaps more freely as compared to Dryden. In the course of the presentation, we also examined some of the important assumptions of the neoclassical period, and we tried to problematize them, and we also tried to identify them vis-a-vis similar assumptions in different ages. For example, we discussed Pope's idea of nature with reference to, or as different from, the romantic notion of nature. We also saw that some of the important neoclassical assumptions, neoclassical values such as wit, fancy, imagination were poorly defined. And for all these reasons, the neoclassicists could move beyond nature, could move beyond the classical precepts, could move beyond mimesis and combine imitation with invention, can combine mimesis with imagination, can combine an adherence on neoclassical precepts with invention of new parameters of judgment, could combine a new approach to literature with the classical approach. And towards the end, I'd like to highlight for you some of the socio-religious, some of the aesthetic, as well as some of the economic foundations of neoclassicism, and these you will also find in the PPT of the module that I have prepared for you. As far as the aesthetic foundations go, we have imitation over imagination, purity of form, nature as the source of truth, balance and proportion, ancient aesthetic values, skills and erudition, knowledge of nature, knowledge of life. These constitute the aesthetic foundations of neoclassicism. As far as the socio-religious foundations of neoclassicism are concerned, these can be enlisted as follows: restoration of British monarchy, cultural colonization, cultural predominance of France, comparison between Pax Britannica and Pax Romana, the tension between Anglicanism and Catholicism, and the changing social codes, social morality of the neoclassical society. Finally, we look at economic foundations of neoclassicism, and these are as follows: decline of feudal economy, decline of the system of patronage, commercialization of literature, emergence of publishers as the new patrons, and emergence of trade, and subsequently the attempt by aristocracy to embrace trade as opposed to feudal economy. So for all these reasons, neoclassicism becomes a very interesting period to study. It's a period in transition, it's a period of extreme polarization, but it is also the period when criticism emerges as a distinct discipline with identifiable features, and it's also the phase where we see emergence of important critical works, critical thoughts through authors such as Pope, Dryden, Samuel Johnson, among others. Thank you.